Hello, this is John Clippinger. There's another episode of First Principles First, and I'm very excited to have as our guest, Cy Canterel, is that pronounced it correctly? And she represents a new mentality, a new way of thinking as sort of a cultural critic that I think embodies a lot of the ideas and principles that we've been exploring here. There's sort of first principles, understanding what intelligence is, getting a perspective on what current events are from the prism of what is happening in AI and creating sentient agents and other the fundamentals of the transition in the effort to understand intelligence and sentience and consciousness. And I think where we're transitioning in first principles first is looking taking these ideas, these frameworks, and applying them to looking at current events and looking at the economy and looking at the culture and what kind of new insights do we get from that. And Sai has done an excellent job in opening this door and this new prism and this new voice. And I'd first like to have her sort of give a little background on herself. She describes herself as a feral scholar, which I love. I mean, that's what's required today. And she has the sort of the abstract machine. So you can set there's a setting right there, a particular perspective. However, I should say, and looking at her Substack and her TikTok videos, she interlaces this with the wonderful literary references and visuals to explain things, but puts it in a perspective that's very different than your traditional cultural critique. So maybe she's sort of moving into the new Marshall McLuhan of our era. So having,
It's funny
having
you
said
bring him
that
up.
there, yeah, okay. So why don't you take it from there, and then we can have a conversation about your many insights.
Yes, John, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be a part of First Principles First. I really admire the work that y'all are doing, and I'll just launch straight into a little bit of background to give the listeners an idea of where I'm coming from. So I started with an interest in technology and computation really early. I was lucky to have both my grandfather, who was a research physician, and my father were both really interested in computers. And so even though I'm hopefully a little older than I look, I actually grew up with a computer in the house from a very young age, even though I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And so we had a Amiga 1000,
Yeah.
which was the same model that Andy Warhol used. And so I actually learned to draw equally digitally as well as physically, and come from a background of art as well as media studies, and so was just really took to it. And this again is coming from the neurodiverse background, but it was like a world that I immediately felt very comfortable in
Right, right, right.
and fascinated by. And so in through high school, I actually was introduced to McLuhan in a Wired article in 1997, which was talking about his influence on the forthcoming web and all of the digital companies and everything that were coming out right prior to the dot-com bubble, actually, and ended up teaching myself HTML, CSS, and JavaScript when it first came out, just to be able to participate in this new world that was coming online. And I ended up going to fine arts school and majoring in printmaking, which really starting back at the beginning and really getting, all the way,
Right,
my
right, right.
most useless skill is stone lithography.
And you got it. Good for you.
Yeah, it's like you really go back to the beginning. So
Very tangible, concrete.
very tangible and concrete. And then ended up going to study at the New School for graduate school,
Ah,
and right, and in media studies, and just absolutely was enthralled by, again, what was going on at the time was new media art was experiencing a real foregrounding. There was Rhizome and iBeam and all of these new organizations were starting to really pay attention to some of the cultural artifacts that were coming out at that time. And also at the, simultaneously we were seeing the rise of social media. And that ended up sort of cannibalizing a lot of what was a really nascent and interesting movement. And at the time I sort of was thinking about it in terms of prior to social media, you had the power of making the context and the content. And those things could be in a dialogue together. And then after social media, you only are putting in content to a context that someone else has decided for you.
That's really important.
And
That's really important. That's an important observation, right?
but
Right.
right prior to that, I went to a lecture that was being given by, do you know Mackenzie Wark, the scholar who's, yeah, for gamer theory. And she had partnered with this very small think tank called the Institute for the Future of the Book. And it was run by Bob Stein, who started Voyager Corporation or Voyager Company and the Criterion Collection. And it was this really strange, small group of scholars and random people who were meeting in his townhouse in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and were just
There you go.
doing things with people. And I watched them give this presentation. And I said, well, that's where I need to be. These are the people who are doing something interesting. And I basically just showed up at the door and said, can you please just let me sit here with you? And you don't have to hire me. I'm just really interested. And I ended up, working for them, working for Bob for about 4 years until the '08 crash.
Right,
And
right.
we lost all of our funding. But through that, I worked with, Larry Lessig. I worked with Sivad Vaidyanathan. I worked
Really?
with, and in doing some of these really interesting, the estate of Doris Lessig, we did a lot of really interesting projects. And so that was always my model for if I could ever get back to that again, that is what I would love to do. And of course, then had to take a 20-year detour through the private sector. And so I've been in tech now for about 20 years and doing all kinds of things. And I worked with infrastructure, so doing everything from aerospace and asset modeling for large assets like power plants.
Really? I didn't. Okay. Yeah. I gotcha. You're right.
So worked on the Toyota Concept I, which was the Calty Design Research's first AI concept car, which is, I think it's now called the LX or LT, something like that. And then most recently I was in blockchain. So I was actually working in generative art.
Nope.
And
Right.
yeah. So just I kind of follow my nose, and just like wherever it seems like there's a horizon that's opening up is someplace where I'm just like, I'm just going to go stick my nose in there and see what's happening. And if it fails, it's fine because I'll come out with something interesting and interesting insight. And so I did get pretty burnt out, frankly, after the last tour. Blockchain, I mean, it was crazy for a while, and then it was a different kind of
I got
crazy.
involved. I don't know. I got involved in that very early too. I mean,
You
and
did?
oh yeah, yeah. We had, I think, we set up an institute called Institute for Data-Driven Design,
Wow.
and that was before Bitcoin. And those two, and then we had at MIT, and we had an event where we hosted at Stanford, and if the bomb had gone off, there would have been no blockchain. We had everybody there, and
Amazing.
we did came out with a book called "From Bitcoin to Burning Man," and
Yeah.
oh, yeah, yeah, that was yeah, and we had a number of retreats at my farm, and then I was an advisor to a number of, and actually set up something in Zug, the Token Commons Foundation. So
Wow.
I've been
I
through
didn't know
that
that.
ringer,
Okay.
as it
Yeah.
um, and I'd be interested in your thoughts of where it's going to go. I mean, I have my own opinions. I mean, that technology now is very old, and there is a whole mythology around decentralization and revelations and how in the singularity and all that coming out. And we learned from that, and now we got this hyper libertarian capture of this whole thing. Uh,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah. And
I think I'd be interested in having gone through it. That'd be a relevant topic here because I do think that you're going to have digital currencies come in, and it's going to. You're seeing it with stable coins. You're seeing Trump et al. Trying to capture that, and I think that you're going to have rug pulls galore.
absolutely.
Um, but I do think there's an opportunity for a new kind of currency that actually is not captive to that and represents the value of nature. And this is maybe we can talk about that. And that's my belief. But another question I have to ask you is: were you ever into William Blake as a poet? Has that ever appealed to you? I mean, because there are
Yes, especially his illustrations, honestly.
and illustrations. And there's a whole group of us who are into this, or a Blakean. I mean, and because he had a whole mythology that's very compatible with this new thinking, and then of course this Prince and this whole idea of being very tangible and concrete, yet very it was paradoxical, I might say. Um, but one of the things that I would sort of like you to explicate is that you have these cultural critiques that you do that I think is a really interesting perspective. And you described the rise of Donald Trump. Anyone who could talk about Donald Trump and black holes and go back and forth. Okay, that's one. I find that wonderful. But aside from that, being understanding the dynamic, there are some basic principles here that are shaping us. They're not a product of us making rational, quote, rational decisions within these boxes. They're part of larger forces that are shaping this, and if we're going to get out of this or evolve out of this, we need to understand them. And I think I don't want to put you on the spot, but anything you want to sort of elaborate on that perspective would be great, for our viewers who have not seen your TikToks or your Substack. But I think from that perspective, and sort of saying how you get this sort of collective narcissism, what that represents, where that ends up going, I think is really interesting. And it is one of the things that we're interested in sort of our commentary and going forward, is bringing this perspective on looking at events and economies
Right.
from this and a new kind of political social science, as it were, due to the feral scholar perspective.
Well, to give a little bit of gloss on the approach, it goes again all the way back to Bob Stein. And one of the things that he said to everyone who was working with him at the Institute, and that really has guided my path since then, is he said, the world suffers from a dearth of talented generalists. And that has always been something that I went forward and said, okay, like that's a risky strategy, right? It's not like to be a generalist in a world of specialists is you're not always going to be appreciated for everything that you can bring to a given situation. But when you can actually draw those parallels across different systems, different schools of thought, different,
Exactly.
perspectives, then you can actually come out with some really interesting ideas, and those can lead to actionable differences when it comes to apply theories.
Yes.
And so that's kind of what I take into the articles that I'm writing at this point, and to, of course, the TikToks, which are usually glosses on the articles. And when we're looking at the systems that we're all faced with now, and I say we, meaning, late stage globalized capitalism, westernized countries. These are systems, right? And if we look at them from a systems perspective, and we look, these are human systems, right? They involve things that are outside of the human perspective as we usually approach it, but they are human systems. And we as humans cannot help but pass along our own blind spots to the systems and tools that we create. And one of the things that we have a blind spot for, it's, again, it's a strength and it's a weakness. Our brains work in narratives, and we understand, we process, we prioritize based on our understanding of narratives and how those narratives inform our identity. And that's a group identity, that's a personal identity. And so that's how I'm approaching all of these things, right? If you zoom out a little bit, you're going to see parallels in what is happening now, both within the tech industry, within the socio-political environments that we're faced with. You're going to see parallels with these larger archetypes, and not to get into a Jungian perspective, because I know
No,
people.
we can do that. We can do that. I mean, you drew the parallel between Musk and Nero.
Yeah.
And so people and people, oh no, come on, can you really do that? Is there really a structural parallel there, or are you just sort of it's a takedown of but I think it's like when they're calling him fascist. Oh no, actually there's a definition that he fits the definition. It's not just a negative attribute. It's actually
Right.
a description. And I think so. The and you were saying, what are the historical precedents when you create certain conditions, you select for certain traits that people embody, and then
Right.
they elaborate them, expand them until they collapse. And I do think, and that kind of thinking used to be you couldn't have that kind of system thinking. And there was an institute at Harvard a long time ago with Sorkin was a philosopher. Okay, you're familiar with that, and Whitehead, and they were
Hmm.
looking at sort of basic properties of complex systems at scale.
Right.
It exhibit, and I do think we're getting the analytics in order to model those things and how to get it
Right.
more and more accurate. Therefore, it becomes a legitimate perspective to make these critiques. But you may want us to riff a little bit on the parallels because they seem to have certain aesthetic tastes that were similar, and
Yeah.
gold on everything.
Like I think we can think of these different sort of categories of narratives or archetypes of narratives more as a heuristic. And so we can sort of tend to see like, again, like this story tends to move in these directions. There are people who will, if the system is set up in a specific way, these people aren't uniquely flawed, right? They're embodiments of something that the system will reward.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
And
That
so Trump is this way, Musk is
that's
this
right.
way,
Right.
and we have set up the again, and everything is a complex system, right? So it's system on top of system on top of system, and the more complex and the more interlaced these systems become, the more unpredictable they become, the more emergent behavioral properties that they exemplify. And so you can have a Musk at the same time as you can have a Trump because we have set up these parallel systems that are interlaced that reward the same kind of behavior. And so then that behavior becomes amplified within the
Exactly.
system. And the properties of entropy, and by when I say that, I mean the
No, I love
properties.
the use of entropy in that. No, I mean, just a little aside because we're big on entropy here, and because the whole idea of free energy principles. So
Hmm.
a lot of our thinking is infused by the work of Carl Friston, who was one of our
Hmm.
and I have great regard for him. I mean, that was my eureka moment when I was looking at complex systems. But Carl, I think, has really put it together, and he has a rigorous way of explaining it, and it scales and it's powerful. So yes, he's talking about that systems, in order to be alive, they have to make predictions and they self-evidence themselves and they're bounded within a Markov blanket, which is basically
Hmm.
their self-definition. One of the things that I'd like to throw out here is that if a system is sort of you have bounded autonomy is one of the concepts, and the
Hmm.
bounding of it's the closure of the definition itself creates a blind spot. It's just like
Hmm.
because
Yes.
it's a total blind spot. You can't and then it becomes not only just a blind spot, but it can have something that you're not going to challenge because if that is not true, then you're not true, and therefore that to me that explains a lot of the facts that you well here's reason here are the facts why don't you change people just cannot accept it and we're sort of in that hell loop that I think
Right.
that you talked about that is that it loops that keeps perpetuating the myth and not allowing the counterfactuals to exist and not seeing them does that make sense to you
Absolutely. And I think, there's and I can't remember whose concept this is, but it is the halo of blindness around certain
right
taboos, right? And that gap becomes larger and
it does
larger the longer that those things go without being interrogated. And so I think now, and these again, they're myths, right? The myth of progress, the myth of meritocracy.
These are really important points. So the idea of meritocracy, I mean, you elaborate very well. You say, well, okay, if you have kids, you shouldn't have too many kids. There's this whole idea, and this is the foundation for a conservative point of view and a free market point, quote, free market point of
Hmm.
view. And there's no notion of structural and embeddedness.
There's no notion of ecology at all.
No, no. And it's illegal to talk about that now in Florida. Well, you're
Right? It's like,
close.
and that is that motivated ignorance,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Because if we question this, if we pull on this little string, well, the whole fabric is going to collapse.
That's right.
And no one knows what to do with that. And I think like this is where I do like, I have some obviously bones to pick with Jung, but I, come from a background where I got really into his analysis for a while.
Sure.
And
No, no.
so, and I think he has some really interesting takes on this. Is this is why he says that to do one's inner work, to be able to hold the tension of existence and to be able to hold discomfort is actually one of the most important things that we can do as individuals. And that then, radiates outwards into the systems that we're creating. Because this is what we've gotten to now, where we just do not have people or systems that can bear discomfort.
Or
And
ambiguity.
or ambiguity or nuance.
Nuance or ambiguity. I mean,
And that's where we get into the realm of kitsch, which is something I'm now sort of like processing. And that's going to
yeah.
be a series of pieces that I come out with next. So
Kitsch. I mean,
kitsch.
and kitsch is emblematic of that. So if you see these processes unfolding, and then sort of how do you see and you sometimes you seem to be optimistic. You say the intervention points here. There's not it's not clear. But when you talk about, and I think I see that part of the analysis where you talk about the labyrinth, and sort of and we're now there's sort of an unraveling, and there's this sort of self-destructive loop, and you're attacking these very things. It's like the autoimmune system is it turned on itself,
Right.
and so and we were attacking our own self. Where does that, in your sense, what comes out of that? What are the options of intervention spaces that you might see that exist? I mean, you again, I think you framed it part of in the labyrinth, and that we could approach it from that vantage point. But I think there's some really interesting dependencies and openings
Yeah.
that need to be explicated.
And, there, I guess it's a complicated, it's sort of Gordian knot there because it's like where you make an intervention into a complex system that is cascading in a given direction. And this is something I get, because of aerospace, like I always think in terms of like human factors, which is something that really comes more with aviation safety. But it's like, where does a human intervene into the system to stop cascading failure? And where does the human actually enable the failure to happen faster? So this is a part of
Yes,
accident modeling. And so we see this from within the technical issues with LLMs. You also see it from within
that's
the government.
right.
And so there's infrastructural systems, and then there are the human interventions that will either serve to dampen or amplify aspects of what could happen with that system. But there's always going to be emergent behavior. And so I think, if it was in a perfect world, we would start intervening to actually, I think one of the most compelling theories that I've heard recently is limitarianism. And it is an idea for there to be essentially a wealth tax. And that I think inequality is one of the most salient factors that we could serve to address in both corporate life and personal life. So I don't think it's ethical or moral for any one person to have $1 billion.
Yeah.
And I think what we are seeing is when you got the globalization of these financial systems that essentially, again, rewarded the same systemic behaviors, then you start seeing a global version of what we are experiencing right now, where you just have rampant inequality, you have rampant ecological extraction, you have
Oh, yeah.
the large groups of people who are economically disadvantaged, who are unable to have any power or say so in the direction and course of their lives, or any ability to create meaning in their lives, because all of the systems around them have been hijacked to sell them something and to sell them back their own authenticity.
Yeah,
And to posit that as a product that you can buy your identity, that you inhabit your identity through acquisition and through display. And that success within that system is posited as something that's going to make somebody else money.
yeah.
And so we just don't have a lot of options. I think that to start with with inequality is probably the best way to go. Now, will we get there? I mean, under this current administration, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because it is the embodiment of the systemic values. And it's only doing what these values actually have been trying to get us to do now for, you know,
So I think that's an inevitable. I mean, I think we have a very mechanical notion of an economy, and it's a machine, and it's a machine. It has no heart. It has no limits. It just has this feedback loop, and so when you get into biology, in a sense, you absolutely know what constraints are, and there are constraints. In order for something to be alive, it not only does it have to make better predictions, but it has to manage energy within a context, and that's embedded in other contexts. And
right.
so your success factor is not the optimization of a single function that you, but actually your being able alignment within a broader context. I think, and out of that becomes real value. And this is what I call symbiotic intelligence, not artificial intelligence. And it is, if you start to look at what is the success of complexity in life and multicellularity, it is that. You have this sort of prokaryotic notion, a bacteria notion of what value is, the max. Whereas actually now I think the AI, this is where my optimism in AI, could be, smoking something, but and whatever. But I think it is, there is a new reality that we're seeing, that value is created through these alignments and symbiotic relationships. And if we're going to create complex things to scale them, this will outcompete the current system. And that you don't create negative externally. And I think what we're starting to see at the intersection of the quantum and the classical is this whole idea. I mean, it's really profound. I mean, and I didn't start out thinking that way. I was a little woo woo here, and I can't go woo woo, and I'll lose credit. And I was like, well, this isn't necessarily woo woo. I mean, this is actually the replication of the science that is getting there, and this sort of intersection between the classical and the quantum and the consciousness coming out of that, and that's a new sense of reality. Now, I think the next generation AI could be pushing that. And when I'm spooked by the whole thing. Like, it's spooky. I mean, it's Einstein, spooky at a distance is spooky right up front. Because one of the things we're experimenting with is I can create a agent of myself. I can give them everything, and I can have a conversation with that self, and then it goes off and reads a lot of stuff. A fraction, it comes back as a smarter version of myself. Wait, what's going on here? I mean, and even writing things. I don't know what your experience is. I'm working on a book, and I have a manuscript of 250 pages, and I'm struggling because I'm trying to get something as a good narrative versus something explains something very complex. And what I find is the people follow along the narrative. As soon as they hit the complex stuff, they're
You
out of
drop
there.
it.
You drop it, right? And so, yeah, okay, that was great, John. I read, but oh, geez, I might glazed over. But that's the important thing. So then I put it in a model, and I curate it, and it condenses it and makes it accessible in a way that I couldn't do. And that's sort of alarming, right? I mean, so there is this co-creation here that and someone who's interested in cultural language and structure, it maybe what these models are collecting is not just a mirror, but they're sort of the laws of narrative, so that you're starting to understand the different kind of narrative structures that some work and some don't, and it's making it explicit in a way was never explicit before. And then you can start to make determinations among different kinds of narratives in terms of their effect, their beneficial or not beneficial effect. Well, I mean,
I think, um, there's a tension between what and we're talking about generative AI specifically, and we're talking about LLMs here. So,
yeah,
yeah, there's a tension between what generative AI and LLMs are capable of currently, and how they're actually engineered, and the financial objectives of the people who are controlling these models, and then again how that's interacting with individual users and groups of users' psychologies. And
could I jump in on that? Because I mean, so I have a strong point of view. And I believe so. These active inference models, you do not have to have these highly parameters models. You can run them as small. They can actually reflect upon themselves. They explain themselves. They go into causal structure. They can run on smaller machines, and they should be open source. Now that doesn't feed in, and they actually don't have a lot of the expensive training that you have. And you brought up the Singapore model. And there are things that you can have really sophisticated models that can explain themselves, but they have this ability to reflect and reflect upon themselves, which is really important, and explain things and come back to you on that, which the LMs don't do. And now I think there's a real tension because they're trying to make the whole industry capital intensive,
yeah,
energy
well,
intensive.
they have to make back their capex.
That's
Like,
exactly. So they put
it's sunk
themselves in
cost.
exactly. They will own it if it's that way, but if it's not that way, then that breaks the financial model. And there's a paper that came out recently. I don't know, it's been around 2 3 months on the Yale Center on Ethics and is a professor at Florida on basically making the argument. I think a formal argument that you can't have generality and certainty at the same time, and
It's a
therefore
Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Yeah.
yeah. So you really, and he makes a pretty a point, the symbolic versus the highly parameterized, but the hybrids or how there's a trade off, and therefore the whole business case of hyperscaling sort of falls apart.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening, and so that's it's an opening, right? I mean, so you
Absolutely, it's an
so
opening.
that's what I think is a new cultural form, a new opening, and a new, I mean, new kind of political, social, economic model can come out of that. That's what I'm hoping. That's where
I think that's certainly a possibility. I think where we are, one of the things that we need to, as a culture, deal with, however, is literacy around around how this technology actually works, because there was a recent paper that just came out in a marketing journal that basically said people's openness to AI is related to how little they know about it. And the people who know less about it are more open to using the technology because it inspires a sense of magic and
yeah,
wonder.
magic growth. Yeah.
And that is actually dangerous. So, what the marketing side of things is saying now is we have to have calibrated literacy, meaning tell them just enough so they still think it's magic, but not so much that they're not willing to use it. Because if you tell them too much, they won't use it. They won't buy the product. And that is what we've seen, all the way back to the genesis of advertising, right? And this is again where I get into the idea of this becoming kitsch, and how so many of these, techno futurist, shading into techno fascist,
Yes.
utopian futures, perfected futures. Like, and this is where a lot of these hyperscalers started. Like, we look at Altman, we look at OpenAI, we look at Anthropic, and it all started, and Musk. It all started with this idea of, well, AGI is an inevitability, and so we just don't want Google to get there first.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Because they're going to be evil with it, and they're going to let it escape the tank like an octopus, like getting out of the tank, and then it's going to kill humanity. And so that's what started all of this sunk cost in the first place.
Totally.
And it's, again, that's a myth, that's a narrative.
Totally.
And now they're twisting that into, okay, well, we have to justify our expenditure. We have to find a way to make this as compelling of a product as possible. We have to foster as much emotional dependency on this product as possible. And so what are we going to do? We're going to, and I think George Lukács, I just had a note here, like, he calls it petrified factuality in terms of the proletariat, again, Marxism, okay, but
No, no,
the proletariat like becoming commodified within this capitalist system, and they have only this narrow slice of access to actual insight. And so the LLM then becomes this, again, mediating screen between a human
sure.
and what constitutes as insight.
So what happens though? I mean, I do think that you're moving from LLMs to agentic structures and do more, and so you're going to have agents, and you're going to have agents act on the people's behalf, and at some point you're going to have this proliferation of agents, and everyone. I mean, so what does that take us? And the people do people have their? I mean, if they don't have their own agent, I mean, then you're in serfdom. I mean, and you're going to be all they're going to just what you described. Is there a scenario where you have absolute control over my agent and myself, and that is my agency, and that is and it's with it, and this whole thing of being bounded, I think, really becomes important. I think the idea that I don't have to have everything, and actually I live within certain boundaries that I create life and richness and texture, and my self-image is not being controlled by my consumerism, and to be able to make that break and design new kinds of architectures that work within those constraints. I mean, what do you see an avenue with new kind of agentic infrastructures that do this, or are they going to be just another agent of surveillance and capture?
I think there'll be both, right? I think like at any point where you see this kind of explosion in a specific form of tool, I mean, technology is a tool. And you see, again, you see like a lot of different people breaking off in given directions. Like you see like the commodification of something, you see like, how do we package this and make as much money? The speculative future, right? And then you see people who are kind of like out there, like the derive, right? You remember this is sort of situationist approach to the web where you're like, you can be anywhere and you're just taking a tour through these interesting spaces and you're seeing what you see and you're taking that along with you as you go. And I think we are starting to see that. There are a lot of people who are using a lot of the more, the open source models, the small language models, the agentic properties, and they're taking it outside of these the cathedral, and they're using it to form perhaps a new commons, right? And I think that's when we talk about edge computing, we talk about
That's where I think it's going. That's. But I think one of the things that I work a lot also in climate and mitigating climate and regenerative finance and stuff. And I do think that if anything imposes, a certain constraints that we make, the denial only works so much. And we're coming up against hard constraints in which even in the economic system, and what I'm looking at is that you have a whole economy based upon extraction that is and it's depleting a resource, it's not reinventing it. So it's not, and it's offloading a risk, and it's going to boom. And then you have the opportunity to create another that actually is incentivized to create a living system to not mitigate. It's a hedge against that, and that it is something that is able to reconstitute itself. It's just not doing full extraction. So there may be at some point a coming a reckoning,
Right.
and I think it's not that far away, because if you see what's happening in the meridional the ocean currents and the temperature, all that it's suddenly you hit, and there's a reality that nature is bigger than you, and was it Bacon that said in order to command nature we need to obey nature, and it's like you said there are rules that we don't, and that may be part of setting the constraints that are not arbitrary, ideologically composed, but actually existentially or scientifically composed.
Well, I think, it's like you set constraints or they will be set for you.
Yes, right.
And that's an inevitability, right? You're going to run into a limit even if you decide not to set one.
That's right.
And I think that's been the story of the last maybe 60 years, is like, where are we finally going to hit up against that limit? In the 70s, it was like, oh, it's peak oil. And, the 80s and 90s, it's like, oh, it's bandwidth or deregulation or all of these other.
There's such a big denial of that. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
the abundance, the singulation, there are no limits. We can live forever.
Well, the
We
system
can generate
depends on
infinite
that.
resources. Right.
The system absolutely depends on that myth. The myth of infinite growth, infinite progress, and defining progress. I mean, to go back to Peter Thiel, as you're saying, he defines progress as these giant moonshots, in these physical, like the Apollo mission, and cancer research and things like that, cancer breakthroughs in physical
Longevity. I mean, it's a whole idea.
longevity.
Longevity is a bit fascinating. Going to Mars, being able to do things. I mean,
But
but
he absolutely ignores that all of those things happened at a time where it was publicly funded.
no, but he also, and we'll get into his discussion of the Antichrist, and he considers
Greta Thunberg?
yeah, exactly. That's where to go.
Poor
Who's the
Greta.
Antichrist? And
Yeah.
but that's so fascinating. I mean, it's really. I mean, it's talk about projection and inversion.
Yeah.
I mean, that any kind of constraint, and then,
Well,
but
he calls her degrowth.
oh, yeah, you're right. But that becomes Antichrist. I
Right.
mean, I mean, and so this is, and that, and it's not just, but it permeates this whole administration. I mean, this is picked up
Absolutely.
by Vance, and this becomes public policy. And it's so primitive. I mean,
Well, it's ultimately, again, to go back to sort of the kitsch theme, but it's like it's playing on these very deep but very instantly recognizable emotional currents.
yes,
And all of it comes back to intolerance of difference, of nuance, of context, and an inability to handle one's own fear of change and anxiety.
fear.
And so it's creating a condition where inside of the walls you have total enmeshment, you have no boundaries. But outside of those walls, nothing gets in. And so this is what they're trying to create. And ultimately, it's to assuage their own fears about the future, which is just wild. That we're creating entire economies, entire governments
Our peers, and not really
based on fear.
peers. I couldn't agree more. But how do you mitigate that?
Well, ultimately, that's doomed to fail, right? Because again,
Yes, but at
it's
what cost, right? I mean,
right. That is the question.
Right.
At what cost? Where does it actually stop? Where do the limits of this system start to put the brakes on? Are those things that exist in the current system? Like, we're seeing the courts be somewhat of a bulwark against some of this, but how far can they go with the Supreme Court being captured? We're seeing the planet itself push back against some of this.
Well, so we've under there's certain basic principles that govern these things. We're trying, so that in fact, can we use that to make predictions of what kind of interventions or things are more likely to happen than others? And your sense, I mean, and so when does this thing break down, and then is there a recognition? I mean, how do you might see that? I mean, I think you had part of that in your analysis of the labyrinth. You had different kind of options being set out, and I think you translated that very well into sort of, okay, why 2026 is so important. I mean, this because you go from the theoretical to actually very tangible things that actually, based upon our statutes and how we succession, the speaker of all these little things that suddenly matter, they're pivotal.
Right.
Like it's like
They're existential.
Mike Johnson is oh shit, that affects everything, right? And so how the House elections go, really, that because you have the succession, and so you get bought. You have this, it's a butterfly vase. One little thing is suddenly changes everything.
Exactly.
And what to focus on and being able to, and I think it highlight that. It's a very different way of looking at these things than in your traditional commentary that's out there, right?
Well, because I think a lot of the commentary, and I engage with it all the time. And I think the holes that I see in it are usually, again, that we are focused. It's so easy to do this, and I do this myself, but we focus on the emotional reaction to what's going on. And we don't look at the movements of the system and the people within that system. And this is, to me, I find that comforting when I can like zoom out and say, okay, wait a minute. what actually, where are the levers here? Where are the feedback loops? Where are the stocks? Where are the inputs? What are the things that will actually tip this in one way or the other? And again, I'm not an augur. Like, I have no way of knowing. But, right, I do, if I had to predict, though, in all honesty, at this point, I would say that, the only thing that's going to really, really move the needle is a massive crash.
Financial
Whether
crash?
that, I think a financial crash, or a governmental crash. So in other words, if he provokes, like he's doing with Pritzker right now in Illinois, or Newsom in California, if he provokes the states to a point where they actually say, all right, that's enough, we're fighting back in a physical way.
But won't he? I mean, if given his strategy, I think he wants to go the Insurrection Act. He wants to get that
He
in.
wants to try that, yeah.
Yeah, and so he needs an external threat. So what? And he wasn't invited to the dictator show, and so in China, and they had much better.
Who's your dictator? Yeah.
And they had a much better show of a full dictator. I mean, it was sort
Yeah.
of evocative of the German Reich.
Yeah.
Those imageries were really scary.
Yeah.
And that sense of coherent force. And I think that he's now seeing as a weak fool. And I think that Chinese are going to say Taiwan. I mean, and I do think that, and I understand that Hegseth is saying that we're not going to support Lithuania, the Baltics. So hey, we got an avenue there. So my bet is that will trigger. They will probably in the next 9 months try to have the takeover, which then gives Trump the option of saying, well, we have a national threat. We have to do this stuff. And he will try to I mean, if anything is predictable, he want to increase his power. I mean,
Yes.
I think that is what he will look for any avenue to do that. The policy doesn't matter. Anything in the immediate that allows him to concentrate his power and assuage his own insecurity will drive him. And so I do think if you start to look at potential pathways, I think that there's a certain high probability of that. Which then it'll have oh, and the other big one is the budget coming up. If they default on the budget, then that's a whole nother.
Yeah.
That's
So there's
another
a lot
issue.
of things in there
Yeah.
that have likely convergences, right?
Right.
And so we have the external issues, the international issues, which also during the summit, apparently China and Russia signed an agreement for Russia to build a huge pipeline for natural
Yes,
gas
yes,
from,
right. I saw
So
that.
that leaves the US completely out of that market. OPEC is already crashing our
Right.
gas and oil markets. So we have the external pressures, the geopolitical issues. We have the internal issues of our economy, which is teetering on the edge of a knife.
I agree with that.
And then we have the internal political issues of how is this going to play out when it comes to the midterms, and what is he going to try to do to stop us from having elections?
Right.
And if all of those things hit at the same time, it's going to get pretty dark. That said, the numbers are against him. We just don't have the numbers in terms of an active duty or even inactive duty military to occupy, to sit on a country of this size. We're about, I think we have maybe two and change million, and we would
Yeah,
need
I think
over
that's
six.
right. Yeah.
They would
Yeah.
need over six. So it's just not possible. And even then, we're an incredibly porous country. There's just so much space. So they know that the military, even if he could get them on board entirely, and they keep treading the line because they'll give people orders that are technically not illegal. So you can't refuse an illegal order.
Right.
But even if he was able to get around those things and was able to deploy everybody possible, and that means pulling people out of the international
That's
strongholds.
right. That's right.
So I don't think we're going to see that level because it's just not, and it's too expensive, frankly. It's just too expensive. We don't have the money. So, and then of course there's the budget issue. Are the Democrats going to force this shutdown? If they do that, can they outlast it? I don't think we have the strength in the leadership to do that. I don't think they have a strategy. They've had 6 months to get a strategy together. I don't think they have one. So even if they don't, even if that doesn't happen, I think all of these things are going to converge at some point where we're going to see a lot of pain for individuals. But
Will be a collapse of credibility of that narrative? Will that narrative sort of die? I mean,
that is my hope.
yeah, I mean, so it is. Well, yeah, well, that's what we're all hoping. I mean, have you followed the campaign of this Graham Paladin from Maine?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
I find that it's a very fresh perspective, a very candid. I mean, he sort of, he's the macho, he's the guy, he's gone on but he comes up and says it like it is,
Right.
and he'll say, well, even among the other vets who are Republicans, they know we go to war to make people rich. It's not, that's
Yeah.
what I learned. That's bingo. And at some point there may be that eureka, and then you sort of expose Trump as sort of Louis the 16th. I mean, it's like, I mean, the excesses, the gold, the obsession with that, then there might be the revulsion.
Yeah, and we can see this as he is an avatar, like the avatar of these systems that we have created. He is our systemic creation. And, whether it's just the campiness of his tastes, the excesses of his past, the, inability to even formulate cogent thoughts, let alone policies. Like these are all things, and the racism, the sexism, these are all things that have been threads
But how
underneath
does
the
that
American
affect the sort
experience.
of the Christian fundamentalist? You right on those. So, but at what point do they let go? I mean, you have that theological cocoon, and how how does that adapt to this, or just denial, or is there a new awakening, or what? How do you see that group being affected by this?
I think so. Russ Vought is the person in the administration who is really the technocrat of the Christo-fascists. He comes out of the Heritage Foundation. He was a major architect of Project 2025. He's the person in the background who is actually being quite effective in
Yeah, no,
pushing through their policies.
yeah, yeah.
So, but again, those policies are not the policies that the vast majority of Americans, even MAGA, wants. And they know this. They've known this for 50 years. They have spent 50 years on this exact playbook, and they are running it now. And they are seeing how far they can get with it. The problem is they tied their apple cart to a crazy horse. And I think like you have those three major factions, right? You have the sort of racial, ethno-nationalist populists. You have the techno-fascists like Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, and then you have the Christo-fascists like Russ Vought and the Heritage Foundation folks. And they want different things. They have completely different ideas about what the future should look like. And again, if the fascist idea is to create a mythologized past and to try to return to a mythologized past that never existed,
That's true.
techno-fascist folks are trying to get to a mythologized future that looks completely different from what these other folks want. They will eventually just, yeah. And they are going to.
You're saying is you had three, and you had the crypto, and you had that different than the teal group. Could you elaborate on that?
The techno-fascist.
Yeah, the crypto fascists. So the heritage group, this.
The Christo-fascist, sorry.
Oh, Christo.
Christo-fascist.
Oh,
Yeah.
Christo. I thought you said crypto. Okay, Christo.
No, they're way out there, and they're not into crypto as far as I know. Like, elaborate on that network.
What's that?
Did you want me to elaborate on that
Yeah,
network?
please,
Okay.
yeah.
That has a super fascinating history, and there's been a number of really great works on it. I personally like Catherine Stewart is a great writer on this, and her book The Power Worshippers is great. There's also Dark Money Network is a great one. But essentially, what happened is back in the I want to say it was the 70s, 60s, 70s. So we had Brown v. Board. We had everything that fell out of that. Then you had a lot of the, Kennedy government administration wanting to go in and tax, tax the church and remove people's tax exempt status who weren't going to actually integrate and after desegregation. And so that was a existential threat to the religious right, to the Christian fundamentalism. And they said, we're absolutely not going to let this happen, but we know that segregation is not a rallying point for the vast majority. We can't build a mass movement on that anymore. So what are we going to pick? So they picked abortion. And that is in part how they unified this, but they also they had incredibly canny, very successful, long-term moonshot plan that is now working out. And so their tie into, extremely wealthy people is pretty obvious. And that's where you get the marriage between folks who really want a theocracy. This is ultimately what they want. They're also, they believe in the second coming. This is why they are aligned to Israel. So Mike Johnson going over to the with the red heifer that's supposed to, sending the guy in Texas who. This is why they want Israel to go ahead and bulldoze the Gaza Strip, because they think that will presage the return of Jesus Christ on earth.
Wow.
So you have some real wackadoos like in all of these groups. And then you've got Teal saying that the Antichrist is, climate activists. And then you've got J.D. Vance and the national conservatives who are saying that the only way we're going to get back to any kind of stability is to only have, Anglo-Saxon Protestants in charge of everything. But they're not in favor of, crazy end times eschatology. So it's kind of like, you're not going to see these folks be able to get along and come up with coherent policies, even if they're able to gain total control through using Trump as their avatar.
So there's a collapse of narratives. There's a collapse and there's a conflict of narratives. And then is there a new narrative that you can see being formed that maybe it doesn't reconcile all these, but actually is grounded in some kind of reality that starts to function? I mean, maybe I'm again smoking something, but I do think that the fact that the science is making explicit a lot of these arguments, and we can test them, and they've been explicit, and then actually build things that work in the scale and are not and can and accommodate nature. I think that may become a rallying, a point where people can go and be actually safe. I mean, I think the whole question, the narrative is there's so much information. What do I trust? What do I do not trust? And is there a place I can go and be it worked in a way that can be trusted, that actually can deliver results and actually function? I mean,
I think in order to do that, and I do think there are those narratives around more directly participatory economies, ecologies, both with knowledge, with community. We are starting to see that where there are even people who have town planning and are sort of unhooking their own economy, the town's economy, from these larger structures.
Yes. Okay.
So we could see that where it's more of a decentralized.
Right. That's right.
And when we talk about resilience, and I think that's really the word for these new economies, they need to be resilient. Right. And resilience is sort of by necessity inefficient. It needs to have redundancy. It needs to have competition.
Ecology is redundant, and anti-fragility, and I mean all of that. I mean, and that's this. But I think there's a principled way of doing that that actually generates value and security and starts to assuage the fears. But I do think this disparity in education or understanding is a big one. I mean, I think that there is a lot of complexity out there.
Yeah, it's hugely complex,
and it really and it requires people to be open to ambiguity. I mean, this is one of your major points, and be able to have two separate antagonistic thoughts in the mind at the same time, and not capitulate to some kind of orthodoxy or a sort of
Not
dogma.
capitulate to a naked emotional appeal.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the hard part because we are all subject to it. You know, we are none of us immune from a strong emotional appeal.
So one of the things I ran into a guy. I was at this conference in Barcelona on the science of consciousness and things, but he was talking about emotional intelligence and being able to and what are the trigger points for people. And it's true and can you build in certain uh, capacities that when you see that's being exploited, then you actually have an intervention that yeah, oh, they're playing the emotion, they're creating a fear. We actually do not have to descend in that. And I actually put that into an LLM and just tried to
Yeah.
explain why that. But I think there's something to that we know our vulnerabilities, we know we're being played, and actually working with David Silverswag at Harvard Medical School, neuroscience, head of neuroscience there, saying, "Oh, what are our we have limited sort of frontal capacities in dealing with this, and there are certain trigger points. Can we have some kind of interface that mitigates that and actually doesn't become triggered by that?" And so there's sort of like a meta knowledge that our emotional states are being manipulated, and we develop that meta consciousness as part of our sense of self. You
And
see?
this I think those interventions, and this is to come back to a very tactile and practical point, but
Yes.
those interventions work better for people who are not constantly anxious about their survival. And this is where the inequality piece comes in. Because if you look at the research, the people who are least susceptible to misinformation live in Finland. Why is that? One of the big things is because they don't have to worry that tomorrow they're going to be homeless. It's one of the most effective suicide interventions is to make sure that someone has an adequate standard of living, an adequate paycheck, a roof over their head, and food on the table. And so this is where it gets a little bit, again, difficult because if we're going to build these resilient ecologies, it has to be in an environment that can support a basic standard of living for most people.
Totally, totally, totally. And then right now that's framed as communism. And
Which, you know, it's so funny
oh, of course, I mean it's just so
because who is more Soviet than Donald Trump?
exactly. He's a Putin clone or wannabe. I mean,
I mean,
it's like no, it's filled with all these ironies. I mean, you know, but if you were to, so your remedies are in a sense to provide those basic fundamentals, basically. The safety nets have been being dismantled. Whether a universal basic income would be the vehicle or not, I mean, that's being thrown around. I think there certainly has to be a basic right of, I mean, people well, and medicine. I mean, you know, I mean,
yeah, healthcare
there's
is a
certain
huge part of
fundamental
it.
rights that you have, um, but how we evolve that out of the current system.
Well, this is where the crash could come
Yeah,
in
yeah,
handy.
that's right. That's right. That's right. Just go to crash.
Because we're seeing the stress being placed on all of the girders at once. I
I
really
agree.
I
I
really
agree.
think so. Like the health insurance industry, the oil and gas industry, the tech industry, everything is being strained to the breaking point right now, and I hate that it's going to have such collateral damage because I really do feel like it will, but that might be the only thing that gets us to rebuild these systems is to actually just stop the momentum.
So, and for that logic, then you would be one to say, okay, well, let's not approve the budget. Let's create a confrontation right now, and have a national strike, or do something that dramatic that would
I mean,
force.
I think that is the most strategic move in the long run. Now, whether we could last in a condition of shutdown for, however long it takes, whether that even is going to work, because, again, this administration, they just do whatever they want, and they're continually pushing through and pushing through and pushing through. That will also reach a crux, though. And
But
so,
then
again,
there may be the states. There may be sort of localization or regionalization of saying, okay, we can't. I mean, so I talking to people working in the Madame campaign and saying, look, the notion that you can't rely upon the federal government anymore,
right,
right? So that's
right,
over, and you can't rely on billionaires. So
right.
there's a new recognition of how you're going to create value and how you're going to organize yourself, and I think that, and you may get some of these localized regional solutions to that. Um, but
We're
right
already
now,
seeing that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But there's no political platform that shows that exemplifies that transition right now, right? I mean, there's not.
No, and this is,
To go. And we don't we're sitting. Where do I
yeah.
jump to, right? Yeah.
Well, that's another system that we're seeing strained to the breaking point, is a two-party system for such a
Well,
giant country with
yeah,
so
yeah,
many
yeah.
different constituencies. That's not working.
Right.
It doesn't work.
That's right.
So, and yet it's impossible to do anything else. So I think this is where we're starting to see, like, the failure cascade again, where it's like one system is pulling on the others, is pulling on this one, is pulling on this one, and so everything sort of gets downed at the same time. I mean, this is how at this point, like, airline crashes happen. It's not because there's a giant failure in some place that's easy to pinpoint. Usually it's something like, in the case of the 2009 crash from Rio to Paris, it's these little it's called the pitot tubes, right, where they super cooled ice because of just what that, a series of coincidences. They happened to go into this one cloud. These little tubes got frozen over, and then because of the atmospheric conditions, they lost radar and plummeted out of the sky because the plane miscalculated the velocity.
Wow.
And then
Wow.
they couldn't pull out of the nosedive because the main pilot had gone to take his rest during that time. So there were so many different failure points, right? It's like the perfect storm is really what it gets to. And that's how you see complex systems fail. It's not just like, oh, the engine caught on fire. You can usually recover even from catastrophic things like that, as long as everything else can bolster that one part of the failing system. But if there's a cascade, it goes down. So this is kind of what I think we're seeing right now. And it's not, the US is like the ground zero maybe right now, but you're seeing, if we go down, a lot of other things are going to go down too.
No, that's true. True. But then, eh, so I mean, in the context of this, the larger conversation that sort of we have like here and looking at new technologies and AI,
Yeah.
what role do you? I mean, one of the things you'll hear, like, I don't know if you listen to Moonshot and those guys and Peter Diamandis,
Sometimes, yeah.
I mean, it's like, oh, it's all going to get better and faster, and these things are all soft, and it's that's details, but I do think that there are pretty profound ways in which we can
Yes.
rethink certain processes and generate value in a way we've never done before. But it's a question of how to distribute that value and who
Right.
owns that value.
Yes.
And so in terms of being able to think forward in terms of what might be the new structure, how is that value at the same time created but redistributed and
Yes.
contained, and what are the institutional structures that we would want? Do you have any ideas on that?
Vague. I mean, obviously, there's, again, it's super, super complex. So I do think there has to be wealth tax. I don't think we get around that. We cannot just continue to allow groups of, like, a small group of people or a small group of companies to hoard and defend their contributions back to the entire social system. It's just not, we can't get around that. So that's kind of number one.
Yeah.
Then we can start to see, like, as soon as we can, without that, I think what we're going to see is a patchwork, right? Like, we're going to see, like, let's say California, Oregon,
Yeah.
Washington sort of start to have their own infrastructure that's separate from the federal government. We could start seeing that
That's
in the
what.
EU.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's sort of regional differentiation there. That because the federal government is not working anymore, you can't depend upon it. You have really strong differences. You can't get it, and so okay, who can get their shit together and really sort of make things start to happen in different localities becomes really important. So it's a
And
breakdown in a federal in the federal system in some sense, and a
well,
redistribution.
and in the globalized system, because
Yeah,
that's going
in
to
the
create
globalized
disruptions
system.
in the
Yeah,
globalized
I
system as
think
well.
that's true.
So then, as far as the technology goes, I think one thing that AI is really good at, and we're already starting to see some, I think, genuinely good uses of it in medicine with some of the recent work on synthesis of antibiotic resistant bacteria and new antibiotics and things like that, is it's really good at taking large quantities of data and based on input deciding what is actually salient and what humans should pay attention to and how to get us from where we are to where we want to be, as long as we're capable of articulating that in a way that is not just feeding into a larger structure that's going to cannibalize that.
Let me be the total utopian here. I mean, just as a response, what there's some really interesting work that's been done in decentralized science and open science,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
there was this recently something called the Synthetics Institute, where they're basically it's an open science platform, and where you actually have these agents go do part of the research, and they assemble things. And there's work been done by Marcus Buehler at MIT in terms of psi agents, and they're making genuine innovations and discoveries. So if you have these collaboratives that learn very quickly and share among themselves, and they're open source, and they create a commons, then
Hmm.
you're creating the basis for a commons a new social structure that innovates very quickly and distributes the value very quickly, and it does not
Hmm.
hoard it. And if you can create economic incentives to do the same thing,
Yes.
then you maybe have the regional forums start to because they can learn very quickly. And this is what I'm interested in new kind of agentic economics, where rather than having things set off by basically arbitrage, you say no,
Right.
here is
It is arbitrage. Yeah.
it's all arbitrage, and so you
The
hire.
entire system runs on arbitrage. Yeah.
And the consensus is based upon this say this, so you do an arbitrage, and then some tries to capture the value, manipulate the value. But if you have something
Until it
that
closes. Yeah.
learns, that actually learns and reduce makes public goods out of that, distributes the
Right.
public goods, and that public goods goes back into feeding the learning, then it outcompetes the system, and that's sort of my utopian hope of an economy that sort of worked that way. Anyway, for that.
I mean, I think it's, this is where and why I got into blockchain when I did too, is because of
Right.
the idea of like decentralization and smart contracts and having, specific conditions and logic determine when decisions are made versus,
Right.
iffy human intervention at given
Well,
times,
this is a really important point that I did want to bring into this talk is that there's this assumption that people should be part of the loop in every part.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, people get corrupted when they're part of the loop, and there are things that are happening so fast that you can't be people in the loop. So, how do you create autonomous agents that actually work within boundaries around certain verifiable outcomes? Because you're going you can't and once you interject people, then they're subject to it's a principal agent problem. They can be captured, right? And
Right.
so what's your thinking about that? I mean,
Well, I think this is where we start to see decentralized governance of AI, right?
yes,
And I think there are some projects out there that are sort of dabbling in this right now. I think some of them are they're still tokenized, so they're a little bit like speculative in
oh
that
yeah,
vein.
that's a big problem, right?
It's a huge problem. So, but if you actually had a distributed ledger for governance, I think you could start to get some really interesting ecologies that develop. And this gets back to the idea too of like what is reality, right? It's a consensus. And so if we are capable of creating support structures based on again our tools, our technologies, that give us a different consensus reality and say, what is value? Value is no longer profit at any cost. Value is how much are we able to keep, let's say, to go back to Lovelock, like keep Gaia in homeostasis.
That's where my
right.
well, I think what you're seeing in biology and it is in cellular is alignment and multiple scales that they dynamically align themselves in order to keep the whole alive.
Right.
And I do think there's a principled way of doing that. I think the way we've looked at, I mean, I was really interested in DAOs when they first came in, and
Yeah. I guilty.
right, exactly. Well, but but I do think that you can see things that I mean, each little entity has its own agency. It has its own blind spots, but others can see its blind spots. So there's a complementarity here that is synchronous, and you see that in living organisms, and so so the alignment with Gaia in a deeper sense. And that sort of overcomes the secular non-secular conflict that people they want to feel part of something bigger than themselves. They don't want to have everything reduced, and they want to be part of it. And I think that enables that kind of sensibility, as it were.
I think it does as well. And, obviously we're far from there. Like that's, but again, it gives an idea of a structure that might be sustainable.
Right.
And I think like if we see major crashes happening with these dominant systems, then we might start to see more of that rise up and get more adoption and to reinforce those feedback loops instead of the ones that have been reinforced over here. And I mean, it actually, these dominant systems are a lot more fragile than most people realize. And the stresses they're undergoing right now are causing them to fail. They are failing. And so I think it is an opportunity, right? Any time that one thing dies, something else rises to take its place. And so that is the opportunity, right? Even if we're just the bacteria that's feasting on the corpse, like I'll take it,
Well, it's something. Yeah, right. Yeah. No. Would you, in terms of your work, I mean, do you see I mean, one of the things I was thinking about it was like maybe there's like a new kind of journalism that comes out of this perspective, and so it's how you report on current events. Because right now, going to the traditional sources they're just repeating the myth. Yeah, I'm not getting real insight. It's just sort of. And so there may be these new kind of journalistic forms that come out. And do you see others in your colleagues who are sort of doing that? And so might there be a new kind of journal network
systems
that looks at
informed.
things
Yeah.
this way? That's what I would hope.
I don't, there are people who are doing things that are analogous. They're usually in a different niche. And I think I'm probably the most magpie of anybody that I'm sort of just like flitting through the field and, alighting on the flowers and trying to make a synthesis of that for people. And I think of it as offering cognitive handholds. We really don't, like, if we don't have a way in to a concept that we understand, then we tend to just tune it out. And I think that's also, again, because those dominant sources are plugged into the same systems, and we're seeing this with people saying, corporate media, et cetera, and independent media is the new thing. But the problem is independent media is trying to build the same kind of system that the corporate media has already dominated.
Exactly.
So again, I don't know because my way is slow. I cannot put out content at the rate that other people put it out. I just can't do it.
Yeah.
And I think if we start to see the slowing down of other forms, like I even think of like, what does slow AI look like? What does slow technological development start to look like? When we actually get to the point where we're going to have these processes, they're going to be inefficient. And that inefficiency is the beauty of those processes. Like if we even look at like veering over to like Japanese aesthetics, like the idea of mono no aware or wabi sabi or yugen, like all of these things that the cracks are there and they let the light in. That is the point. You don't close off the cracks. You appreciate these things for their earthiness and for their eventual death.
Well, that's really interesting point. I agree. So you mentioned I've worked with a number of Italian friends, and so the whole artisan economy and Terra, and it's a set of relationships that people have, and it highlights not the efficiency, but the uniqueness
Right,
of different people, and be able to situate something and value the situatedness of things, and as
right,
long as it can be financially sustainable, and I think that, in other words, resist the inroads of the extractive system. If we can
right.
develop the way of resisting that and sustaining that, then I think people will gravitate towards that,
Absolutely, they do.
and so that I think is like a how can you prevent the parasitism, the predatory takeover of that. But if you allow that to happen, it develops a redundancy in relationships that people will gravitate to. And I mean, one of the things I notice, say, I live in northern New Hampshire, and in the early days, is that the community economy was community, and in the sense that if someone I would say, well, how much do I owe you? And he said, what do you think it's worth? And I said,
Right. Yeah.
and, and the idea to overcharge in a small community, you're taking it from someone else and putting it in your own pocket. And so there is that sense of reciprocity
Right.
within the economy that need to be restored. And I think that's a deep sensibility that people take a lot of pleasure in it being so it's really maybe protecting that. I mean, that's where I come out.
Absolutely. And I think, this sort of reminds me of Lewis Hyde and The
Yeah, or
Gift.
Lewis
If you've,
Hyde,
yeah,
the friend. I mean, yes, the gift.
just
That
gorgeous. Yeah, the
This,
gift economy. And
yes.
and
That's
again,
it.
the idea of value being
Right.
something that's not an economic value, it's a spiritual value. It's a value of transcendence. And I think,
I, I,
when we start to
oh,
see our basic needs taken care of, then we can focus more on those properties. And to Maslow, right, but it's like we can't get to the point where we are self-actuating if we can't get food in our mouths.
but part of I mean, if you look at what keeps societies together is the sense of reciprocity.
Yes.
And it creates the boundary condition and money. That's what is interesting where money it reinforces or breaks that down. And I think a reinvention of money in the sense of reciprocity. This is another thing that interests me, is how that maintains the boundaries of the communities that people can they reciprocally live together as a whole, and not are subject to the extraction of a Wall Street.
Right.
The fungibility into Wall Street is a problem. But anyway.
Yeah, and I think this gets at the reciprocity is sort of a mutual responsibility, right? And that's where you get extraction. There's no mutual
But
responsibility.
that's where that worries me about the universal entitlement program is it doesn't it's sort of it's sort of like a carbon offset. It's like you create the problem, and then you try to create it. But this, if you have a sense of reciprocity, then it's mutual value creation, and it's not an entitlement. So you have a meaningful participation in the system, rather than and that's different than a sheer entitlement.
I think
No?
like with the idea of UBI, like and again, I'm not like
Yeah,
I'm not
I got
taking
you.
like a strong
Right.
position pro or anti, but my thoughts on it is when UBI is like the bottom, right? That's like the bare minimum for what you need to survive in a given society. It's not saying like we're gonna make everybody
Yeah.
a
Yeah. No.
leisure class,
Right.
and and again, we're not gonna make everybody a leisure class, and we're not gonna focus leisure around consumption, like because that's a huge part of that like when we think of like, oh, I'm just handed a living income, what am I going to do? I'm going to go buy stuff and I'm going to sit in front of the TV. Like we actually have to redefine what like cultural engagement looks like
Yes.
in that context. And I do think you're going to start to see, I know this is counterintuitive, but I do think you would start to see for those, there are some people who just are going to want to stay and do what they want to do, even if that's play video games at that basic level. But most humans They
right.
have dreams, they have aspirations.
Yeah,
And if they're shown a way to have a
that's right.
meaningful impact,
Yeah,
they're going to want to do
I
that.
agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that.
Most people just can't because the only thing they could do is work three subsistence jobs.
Yeah, that's right. So that's, I think that's you really okay. You said the wealth tax limit and a bottom UBI. It's great to meet you,
Yeah, you too.
yeah, really great, and I totally encourage you. I'm a subscriber,
Thank you.
and so uh, and I'd love to see that ecosystem evolve. So let's stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do
Okay,
stay in touch.
okay.